Hello, this is a revision session on the topic of democracy and participation. There are four parts to this topic, which you can see on the screen there: current systems of representative democracy and direct democracy in the UK, a wider franchise and debates over suffrage, pressure groups and other influences, and rights in context. This particular session will focus on the top one: current systems of representative democracy and direct democracy in the UK. In particular, we will focus on the key terminology, the key points from the specification, what you could be asked in the exam, and how you go about answering those questions. So please do feel free to skip around in this recording to find the bit that you need. Starting with the key terms, some of these are more relevant to this particular topic, so we will stick to those for now. So the first one is legitimacy. In politics, legitimacy refers to whether power or authority have been acquired in a way that is deemed to be fair or acceptable. In a country like the UK, the fairest way for someone to acquire power or legitimacy would be through democratic means, so being elected, in other words. Direct democracy. Democracy means people power, and in a direct democracy, citizens are given power over political decisions. They make the decisions themselves. Representative democracy is a political system which also gives power to the people. However, it does so through allowing the public to choose representatives who make those decisions for them. Pluralist democracy refers to a political system which gives power to the general public, and in various ways it allows and encourages for a wide, diverse range of views to be put forward. Plural often being used in language to refer to a multiple of something. So in a pluralist democracy, we would typically expect there to be freedom of speech, freedom of association, and various other civil liberties that allow for a range of views to be heard. Deficit refers to a lack of something. So a democratic deficit refers to when there is a lack of democracy within a particular political system. Participation crisis is a term that is sometimes used to describe a drop in the amount of participation that there is within a given political system. So there are key terms for this particular topic. What we have here is basically taken directly from the specification for this topic. So think of it as a checklist of things you need to make sure you have covered in some detail yourself in order to have covered this topic properly. So there are three key points. So one is the features of direct democracy and representative democracy. So by features, we're talking about things that they have. So you might want to consider things like how can citizens participate, how often do citizens participate, how legitimate is their form of participation, and so on. The next one is similarities and differences between direct democracy and representative democracy. So again, you might want to think about things like how people participate, frequency of participation. It could be other things as well, such as how educated people maybe have to be in order to participate. And the final one is advantages and disadvantages. So a comparative one here. So you would need to pick a few different issues and weigh up the good and bad points for both and be able to compare the two. So as a general checklist of things to compare them on, I would consider participation, representation, power dispersal, accountability, and education, amongst other possible factors for comparison. We also have at the end there consideration of the case for reform. So essentially knowing various ways that democracy could be improved and what the arguments for and against those options would be. So we'll now move on to look at the possible essay questions. So I've picked out three here. They may not be worded exactly this way, but the wording would essentially be along these lines. It wouldn't be anything particularly different to what has been put forward here. So the three that we're going to look at are: How far do you agree that the more frequent use of referendums would be the best way to improve democracy in the UK political system? To what extent is the UK experiencing a crisis in political participation? And assess the view that there is a democratic deficit in the UK. So we'll look at each of these individually. We'll make sure we understand what the question's asking, how to approach it, and what some of the key things to include might be. So the first question then, how far do you agree that the more frequent use of referendums would be the best way to improve democracy within the UK political system? What the question is more broadly asking you is what would be the best way to improve the democracy within the UK political system? What it is then asking on top of that is, would using referendums more often be the best way to do this? So in order to answer that question, we firstly do need to consider the more frequent use of referendums. So what would be the good and bad points about doing that? However, if the question is asking you, is this the best way of doing it? That implies that there may be other ways of doing it as well. So we will also look into what some other possible ways of improving democracy would be, and we'll look at some of the arguments for and against those. And what you ultimately have to do in your answer is make an argument as to whether using referendums more often is the best way of improving democracy, or whether it's one of the other issues that you are going to discuss. So first of all, on the table on the screen there, we can see it's divided. On the left-hand side, we've got arguments that in various ways contribute to the idea that more frequent use of referendums would be the best way of improving the political system. However, on the other side, we've got some of the counter arguments to that. Now, the arguments nearer the top are the ones that are specifically about referendums, and then the ones beneath are some of the alternative arguments that we're going to consider. So I've tried to categorize the arguments as well. What you could try to do perhaps is to write maybe a short paragraph on 2 or 3 of these categories that you feel that you're most confident in writing about. So we've got things like power for the public, representation, participation, education, and accountability. So I would, in my answer, in the main body of my answer, I would pick maybe 2 or 3 of those, and I would write a short paragraph about whether using referendums more often would or would not help with that particular issue. I've chosen those issues because they are some of the key things that you should have within a democracy. So if referendums are good for that thing, it is therefore also good for democracy. So we'll start with power for the public. So if we were to use referendums more often, it would give more control to the public, because essentially a referendum is kind of like a one-off form of direct democracy. You are actually giving the public control over a decision rather than leaving the decision to be made by politicians. Of course, the public can influence politicians, but they cannot control what politicians do. In a referendum, the public are in control for themselves. The counter argument for this, though, is that in the UK at least, referendums are non-binding. This means that Parliament are free to ignore the decision. Parliament is sovereign and does not have to take up the decision that has been made by the people in the referendum. Though, as a counter to that, we could say that it is politically very unlikely that this would happen due to the backlash the politicians may come up against. The second issue we have is representation. So firstly, if we were to use referendums more often, this would show what the public want accurately. So we would know for sure exactly what the public want. Therefore, a more representative outcome could be made. In normal circumstances, politicians have to, I suppose, assume what they think the public want. And sometimes this is not entirely accurate. So evidence for that could be the European Union referendum in 2016, where the public were widely expected to vote in favour of remaining in the EU. The result not going that way shows that perhaps politicians did not have an accurate understanding of how the public felt, and therefore that shows the flaws in representative democracy when it comes to politicians trying to represent the public. On the other hand, there are a couple of counter arguments here. So one is that there are limited options. Referendums tend to have just 2 choices. Sometimes there's a situation where there might be several possible options that people may be interested in, but are not always options on the ballot paper. A good example here could be electoral reform. In 2011, there was a referendum on whether to change the voting system from first past the post to the alternative vote. Many would argue that if a different system had been on the paper, a more proportional system perhaps, then the outcome may have been quite different. Secondly, we can also argue that turnouts can affect how representative referendums are. If a referendum has a high turnout, then you could argue it does represent public opinion. The Good Friday Agreement in 1998 and the Scottish independence referendum in 2014 are both examples of where there was a high turnout. In both cases, it was above 80%. However, not all referendums have turnouts that high, and in these situations, you could question whether they really are representative of the public, particularly if they are under 50%. The AV referendum in 2011 only had a turnout of 42%, so that may be a good example of that issue. We'll move on to participation now. So participation is a healthy thing to have in a democracy. So referendums could be good because they provide, firstly, an extra opportunity for people to participate, and secondly, there have been high turnouts for some of these referenda. As we mentioned earlier, Good Friday Agreement and Scottish independence in 2014 are good examples. The counter argument to that is that many others have had lower turnouts, such as the AV referendum, referendums about whether to adopt elected mayors in particular towns and cities as well. So these all demonstrate that maybe the public do not always take the opportunity that they have to participate. Education is our next one. So we could argue that referendums are good for education because the media will report on the issue more as we have a build up to the referendum, and the public will learn more about the issue that they're going to vote on. Both sides will campaign in the referendum, and this will help the public to gain a greater awareness of political issues. If you take something like the European Union, for example, people certainly on the whole would know a lot more about it now than they would have done in 2015. However, campaigns can be misleading. I mean, the most famous example probably is from the EU referendum, where the Vote Leave campaign had campaign material that said that £350 million could be given to the NHS if Britain left the EU. They never said that it would be given or that it had to be, and they are not a political party. The campaign team are not in a position to do that, so they would argue it was the misinterpretation of the public, but nevertheless, many of the public were misled. We also have to take into account that the public therefore maybe do not understand politics any better, and perhaps that these misconceptions could even be dangerous. Our final one is accountability. Referendums would not necessarily improve accountability at all, on the basis that referendums are carried out using a secret ballot, so we don't know how people have voted, so we can never know for sure who voted for what, and therefore we are unable to hold anyone to account. There would equally be no mechanism for holding members of the public to account for the decisions they've made, unlike with politicians. So now we've looked at 5 key issues relating to democracy, and we've looked at the impact referendums would have on those, so evidence for and against. So at the end of that, you would have to make a call on the whole, how much improvement would using referendums bring? Would it make the UK far more democratic, a little more democratic? Would it make the UK less democratic or significantly less democratic? So you need to pick an option based on the evidence that you've put forward. You would then need to look at some other issues. Now, I've picked out 3. There are others you could use, but the 3 I've chosen here are lowering the voting age, electing the House of Lords, and changing the voting system. So again, for each of these, we would have to look at the arguments for and against and weigh up how significant this would be as a change before we're able to then compare it against the increased use of referendums. So with the voting age, so typically this would be to lower it to 16 years old. This has happened, of course, for Scottish and Welsh local elections in the Scottish independence referendum as well. So it's not without precedent in the UK. Lower voting age would increase legitimacy potentially if more people were able to take part. It would also give more power to the public because a wider range of people would be able to vote, and just a higher number of people would be able to vote. However, lowering the voting age as a way of increasing legitimacy is dependent on turnouts. If turnout decreased, then we could argue that it would not help. And younger people are statistically the least likely to vote. So the odds are that lowering the voting age would increase the number of people voting, but perhaps not the percentage of people voting. And therefore, it might not actually help in terms of legitimacy. So with the House of Lords then next. So we're starting on the right-hand side because this is the argument in favour of this issue as opposed to referendums, which are on the other side. So the House of Lords. So firstly, it's a way of giving more power to the public because we would have the power to choose who sits in the House of Lords, gets to contribute to the discussions and debates there, and gets to vote on legislation. It would therefore also make it more representative because we could choose people that reflected our own political views. It would also make them accountable. If we were unhappy with what Lords were doing, we would have an opportunity to get rid of them and replace them with someone else. And again, it would increase legitimacy. It is fairer for these Lords to have a say in what laws we live by if they've been democratically elected. Counter to this, one concern is that the public may not be interested. General elections sometimes struggle to motivate the public to turn out. Local councils and regional bodies often struggle for high turnouts. So what's to say that the House of Lords would be any better than that? So a low turnout would actually perhaps be, again, damaging to legitimacy. And there are also arguments that having an unelected House of Lords actually benefits our political system. For example, Lords do not have to be concerned about making decisions just because they think they'll be popular. If they feel that they know best about an issue, they can make that decision without pandering to public opinion. Our final issue then is electoral reform. So, in other words, changing the voting system. If we were to switch system, basically any alternative would be more representative. So as we know, under first past the post, there are a huge number of wasted votes. If you don't vote for the party who wins in your constituency, your vote makes no difference to the national result. Other systems would allow you to perhaps have second or third choices, which may end up counting towards the result, and therefore there are less wasted votes. The overall result is more likely to reflect what people have voted for. On the other hand, one of the major concerns about electoral reform is that it would be less likely to create a single party government that could pass laws. This, in theory, could lead to a weaker government that would struggle to pass legislation and be less productive. So we've been through the arguments now. It would be your decision at the end, but you would have to weigh up how beneficial using referendums would be more often compared to the other three factors we've looked at there: lowering the voting age, electing House of Lords, electoral reform. So you would argue that it's either the best option, the worst option, or it's somewhere between some of the other options that we've got. So that's our first question. Move on to the second one. So our second question is, to what extent is the UK experiencing a crisis in political participation? So this is a suggestion that there has been a decline in participation in UK politics, and your job will be in this answer to weigh up whether that is true or not. So firstly, participation is an important issue, as we've discussed earlier, because if people do not participate, then it's hard to argue that the decisions that are being made do reflect what the public want, and therefore, is it really democratic? So high participation improves legitimacy and how representative decisions are. So I've picked out three issues here: voter turnout, party membership, and alternative forms of participation. And what I would try to do in my answer is build a paragraph around each issue, first outlining the point and the evidence in support of there being a crisis in that area, then explaining how this is relevant to the question, before then considering what the counter evidence is. And then at the end of the paragraph, I would have to make a call on which side of the argument was stronger for that particular issue. So we'll start with voter turnout. So voter turnout for general elections in the 21st century has been consistently lower than voter turnout in the 20th century. So all 20th century elections, certainly past the Second World War, had a turnout of 70% or above. No election or general election in the 21st century, so the House of Commons, has had a turnout of 70% or above. The lowest turnout in particular would have been 2001 at 59%. So when you're explaining that, it's really important not just to say that turnout is between 60 and 70%, but to say what it was previously so that the examiner can see the point of comparison. But then we can go even further. We can say, well, that's for general elections and they have the best turnout. If we look at other elections, we can see that turnout is even lower. Devolved institutions like the Scottish Parliament struggle to even reach 50% turnout. Local councils frequently have turnouts of about 35%. And police and crime commissioner elections across the country have had turnouts of around about the 10% mark. And there are cases of polling stations where no one has gone to vote across the whole of the day. So if we look elsewhere, it's an even worse situation. But then we need to weigh that up against the counter evidence. So while voter turnout in the 21st century for general elections is lower than it was in the 20th century, there has been a steady increase, or at least up until 2017. So from that low point in 2001, it crept up by a few percent each time up to 2017 when it was up to 69%. However, we do have to bear in mind that it did dip again in 2019 by a couple of percent. Another point to raise here is if we look at another kind of voting, so not elections, but for referenda, turnout can be much higher. So the Brexit referendum had over 70% turnout. Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland, 81% turnout. Scottish independence referendum, 84% turnout. However, again, that's not true of all referenda though. For example, the AV referendum on 42%. So that's voter turnout. So at the end of that paragraph, you look at the evidence you've put forward on both sides and you do a short sentence explaining which of the two sides you feel is stronger there. Our second issue is party membership. So how many members of the general public are members of political parties? So it is significantly lower than it was 40 plus years ago. So if we were to go back to the post-war era, say, up to the early 1980s, political parties, a number of political parties would have had memberships in the hundreds of thousands. In the case of the Conservative Party, I think in the early 80s, it was over 1 million people. It is much, much lower now, to the point where some political parties no longer publish their membership figures because of how poor they are. So in the case of the Conservative Party, in the early to mid 2000s, 30 years on from their having just over 1 million members, they had just over 100,000 members. So it's about 10% of what they were previously. And this is across the board. Other political parties have dropped off as well. The reason why this is important is because political parties allow ordinary members of the public to have influence over the political parties, who in turn get elected and decide what laws we live by. Counter arguments to this: some political parties have grown their memberships in more recent years. The Scottish National Party saw a surge in membership around the time of the independence referendum. Perhaps more notably, the Labour Party, after the election of, or around the time of the election of Jeremy Corbyn to be their leader in 2015, saw a huge rise in the number of members that they have, over 500,000, making it, I believe, the biggest party in terms of membership in Western Europe. However, this still isn't quite at the level that we saw 40 plus years ago, and this is true of maybe a handful of parties, but not most of them. The final point we would raise is if we look at alternative forms of participation, we've seen a growth in participation in these areas, roughly coinciding with the decline in voter turnout and party membership. So if we take pressure groups, for example, pressure groups have much higher memberships in some cases. So while we said there's maybe just a small handful of political parties in the UK with memberships of several 100,000, there would be a far bigger number of pressure groups in the UK that would have memberships of that size. The biggest pressure group in the UK, the RSPB, has over 1 million members. And it's not just them, as I say, there are a number of them that would be in the hundreds of thousands, whereas the political parties, we're talking just a few. However, that's not true of all pressure groups, of course. That's for the kind of some of the more successful ones. There are many more pressure groups out there that have far fewer members, but there are far more pressure groups than parties, of course. Petitions would be another one to mention, particularly since the introduction of online petitions. We've seen them becoming a major sort of avenue of political participation. Biggest petition in UK history being about revoking Article 50 during the Brexit process, which had several million signatures. Protests as well. We've seen a number of protests in the UK with hundreds of thousands of people, again, roughly coinciding around the time that we've seen the drop in voter turnout. So the Iraq War in 2003, anti-Brexit protests, anti-austerity protests, Iraq and Brexit in particular having over 1 million people out on the streets campaigning. So in that sense, participation is alive and well. However, what we also have to consider is that maybe these forms of participation are not as effective. When you vote, you are actually deciding who will be your representative and be able to decide what laws we live by. If you are a member of a party, you may be able to control who the leader of your party is or what policies they pursue. Things like petitions and protests can influence politicians to make a certain decision, but they cannot force a politician to make a certain decision, as highlighted by the fact that the two biggest protests ended up failing because the Iraq War and Brexit both still happened. So at the end of that essay, then, you would have to make a judgment on which side of this argument you consider to be stronger. So our final question then is assess the view that there is a democratic deficit in the UK. So a democratic deficit suggests there is a lack of democracy. So what you would need to do in your answer is think about the different ways perhaps in which there is a lack of democracy. Explain why that lack of democracy exists, but then counter that against how serious is this, how undemocratic is it, does it really matter? So I've picked out 3 main ways in which the UK could be seen as being in a democratic deficit. So we have undemocratic institutions, participation, and centralisation of power. I think the first 2 are probably the most important to focus on. So undemocratic institutions, first of all. So democracy, remember, means people, power, deficit, a lack of something. So there are various issues that we can take into account here. So the House of Lords, for example, unelected by the public. The monarchy, unelected by the public. The Supreme Court, unelected by the public. Even our voting system, where we do get to exercise political power, many would argue is unrepresentative, lots of wasted votes, discourages participation. So even that in some respects could be seen as undemocratic. So we've got these various things within our system that are that we cannot control, that do not represent us, they are not accountable to us, they lack legitimacy, and they do not encourage participation. Counter arguments to this. So one would be about limited powers. So our political system, our constitution, has evolved over time to reflect changing attitudes about how politics should work. So while, for example, we still have a House of Lords that is unelected, we've also stripped the House of Lords of many of its powers. The House of Lords does not have the same political power as the House of Commons. So we could say, yes, it is undemocratic, but as a result of that, it has less of a say in what goes on. The same is true to a more extreme extent with the monarchy. the monarch is there for largely ceremonial purposes. They have no real significant political power. The second issue we've got there is, on the is not side of the argument, is a lack of public interest. So if we did elect Supreme Court justices or the House of Lords, then would the public actually care very much about that? We can't know for sure. Some people probably would care, but with declining turnouts in other elections, how can we be sure that the public will even take part in those elections? In terms of the voting system, the public had the chance to get rid of first past the post a few years ago, but chose not to. So again, we could argue that that shows that actually this is not so much of a problem. So that's undemocratic institutions covered. So then we have participation. So we know that there is low turnout in some elections, in particular local elections. We know that trade unions are not the force they once were. So trade unions, while not perhaps as specifically a political form of participation, nevertheless gave the public some degree of control over their work, their income, the conditions in which they worked. Unions also had a bigger level, some political influence over certain political parties, but unions are not the force they once were. So people are no longer participating in them, and they don't have as much power anyway. And some of the alternative forms of participation, as we've already discussed today, do not have necessarily a particularly big impact on what goes on. On the other hand, turnout for some elections is a bit higher, particularly referenda, and we know that in recent general elections it has increased, or at least up until 2017 that was the case. Pressure groups, petitions, protests do sometimes make a difference, and there is a huge amount of participation in some of those things. So success is not never going to happen through those things, just not all of the time. The last one is centralization. So what we mean by this is that too much power is concentrated into the hands of too few people, which in theory allows them to abuse their positions at the expense of the general public. So this could be a threat to liberal democracy. So what are the things that contribute to that? So firstly, we have a unitary constitution. So that means that only one body has sovereignty within our political system, and that's the Houses of Parliament. So there is nothing in that sense to keep the Houses of Parliament in check, although you could argue the public do that through elections. We have devolved some of those powers to kind of spread them out across a wider group of people, but there are limits to how much power these devolved groups have. So for example, even the Scottish Parliament, the most powerful devolved institution in the UK, does not really have any foreign policy or defence powers. Some would argue that our political system is actually an elective dictatorship, which means that we elect it every few years, but once that party is in power, no one can stop them doing what they want. This is in part due to the voting system that we have, because it tends to produce majority government, so one party rules the roost and doesn't have to cooperate with anyone else. And this means that, yeah, there is very little that Parliament can do to stop a government that has a big majority. And there are certain powers that the Prime Minister has that other people can't influence. So for example, choosing who's in the cabinet. The Prime Minister doesn't need the approval of anyone else when they're picking people to do certain ministerial roles. That is not true of some other countries where there are various other groups that have to approve of presidential decisions. Counter to this, devolution has given, if not all, then a lot of power to various devolved institutions like the Scottish Parliament, Welsh Parliament, Northern Irish Assembly and London Assembly. And some of the powers that the Prime Minister holds, such as, referred to as the prerogative powers, have shifted, albeit by convention, to Parliament. So while it's not a written law and therefore not enforceable, there is an expectation, at least now, that a Prime Minister will go to Parliament before taking military action, for example. So we've looked at three ways there in how the UK could be seen to have a democratic deficit. We've looked at the evidence and arguments for and against this, and that's what you would have to explore in your answer. And for each individual point, weigh up which side is stronger before making an overall decision. Is there a deficit or not? To what extent is there a deficit? Is there maybe more of a deficit in some areas than others? So that concludes our look through the first part of the democracy and participation topic, current systems of representative democracy and direct democracy in the UK. I would recommend strongly having a look at the Edexcel website and looking at the past papers, having a go at planning answers to those, using the mark schemes to check whether you're on the right track, looking at the examiner's reports to give you tips about do's and don'ts when answering these questions. And if you have any further questions about anything, please do get in touch and I'll do my best to get back to you as best I can.